and Cultures at the University of Liverpool. Reba is an academic, historian, writer and classical singer. She has written Margot, Nivedita of Vivekananda, another Videshnis. Conversing with them is Syeda Hameed. Dr. Hameed is a feminist and writer and passionately engaged in public affairs and social issues, especially for women and minorities. So the year 2018 has truly been the year of women, and the theme of the discussion fits in well with the thrust of KSLF, the rise of women in the age of #MeToo. And just one further announcement, Dr. Syeda Hameed and Ian Magedera may have to leave very soon because they have a flight to catch, in which case Reba will be there to continue with her session.
His name is written there. Feeling better.
Hello, can you hear me?
Papa?
Good. Getting right to the subject. Its subject certainly resonates with the theme of this conference. And two wonderful, remarkable books. One by Ian Magedera, the one I'm holding in my hand, called The Indian Videshnis, and the other one which Ian is holding, which is Reba Som's book about Sister Nivedita. Margot.
Can we have just one more?
So I want to begin get into the heart of the subject. The word Videshni is something which many people may not have come across. I think that these were women who came and made India their home. So Videshis and Videshnis. And I want to start by saying that whereas Reba deals with Sister Nivedita of Vivekananda, Ian deals with 9 Videshnis, 9 women. And I think it's a lot of learning, and it's a both are many-layered narratives, and it would be very difficult for us to encompass everything in the limited time. But I want to get right into the heart of the subject by quoting a small quotation from Ian's book, which equally applies to Reba's work. And this is written by an angry Pandit character in a novel. And please listen to this very carefully. Write about foreign women who came and stick their noses into our affairs. Write about those ladies who come here to suck out the brains of our people. Write about Madame Besant. She is a political subject. I do not reproach Sister Nivedita, the valiant companion of Vivekananda, for anything. I do not reproach foreign women for anything if they do not seek to take power. This struck me, and I'd like to begin with Ian remark on this in the light of the 9 Videshnis, and then I will come to Reba, remark on it in the light of Sister Nivedita. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Syeda. Hello everyone. When I walked into this space yesterday as a member of the audience, I was coming to KLS LitFest for the first time. It's an absolutely wonderful space that you have here, and long may it continue. It's an absolutely wonderful space. So, as you know, this is a very, very different literature festival from any other. So long may it continue, and thank you so much for inviting me. The story in my book starts in 1893 with the arrival of Annie Besant to Tuticorin, Tuthu Kudi, as it's now called in Tamil Nadu. So Annie Besant, she arrived there, and I take that date as the start of a period which runs until 1947 and a few decades beyond. During that period, India was thinking itself, fighting, struggling itself free. And so, in general terms, there was a decline in the influence of Europeans. But in this time period as well, in the same time period, there was a certain group of Europeans who were increasing in influence. These were European women who had made India their home. These were women who self-identified, Annie Besant self-identified as an Irish woman. There were women who self-identified as Swiss, for example, Simone Tata. There was Suni Tata, the mother of J.R.D. Tata. There was Mira Alfassa, the French woman who became the mother of Pondicherry. There was Agnès Bojraju. I wonder who she is. Does anyone know? Mother Teresa, Saint Teresa now, who was born in Macedonia. She self-identified through her language group as an Albanian. So there are all of these other women who were gaining in influence during that period. An absolutely incredible period. And the question that I set out to ask myself was why? How did this happen? How did these women have a counterintuitive start? How did they manage to gain so much influence? Well, of course, this is because they immersed themselves into the culture. Anyone can, I think, dispute to a certain extent. You know, some of their interactions with Indians were very, very controversial. There is no doubt about this. But there was a significant impact, and their influence in India cannot be denied. And the reason for that is because they were non-British. You see, this is the thing. They were non-British.
They were non-British.
Yes.
They were Europeans. They were Turkish princesses, Princess Niloufar and Dureshehvar. But I want to turn to Reba, because the only character, or only woman who was singled out as not poking her nose into Indian affairs, according to this quotation, is Sister Nivedita. So tell me, why was that an exception?
Well, for one, can you hear me? For one, Sister Nivedita came to India and made India her home. And in the cenotaph in Darjeeling, where she died in 1911, it says that here lies Sister Nivedita, who gave her all to India. In all her speeches, in all her writings, she writes about we and us. So never as a distanced observer, as a foreigner, does she view India. She views India on her own terms, because she was a student of Pestalozzi and the whole kindergarten system of education, which says that never judge a country from a perspective that comes from outside, but view that country from its own internal traditional values. And that's what she did all along.
So, Ian, in your book, you have 3 Irish women, 2 Turkish princesses, 1 Albanian woman, 1 French woman, and another French woman from a completely different area, and 1 Swiss woman. So when you look at all of these women, what is the common thread, and what is the major difference that strikes you in the way that they made India their home, and their souls, in a sense, became melded in this region, in this territory?
All of these women had a natural affinity, obviously, with India. But it's very true that these women never acted alone. They always had an Indian support system behind them, be it a family, be it an elite of some sort, be it a group that was supporting them. And this is the fascinating thing about looking at women. As a man, looking at how women actually achieve social change. That was, you see, generally, when a man is biographized, a man is created as effectively as a biographical subject alone, as a sole actor. You see? Whereas women are always integrated into the support systems behind them. And that was the thing that struck me in different ways, in many different ways,
like
Syeda.
in some of them by marriage.
Yes.
Sonia Gandhi is one of the Videshnis in your book. So is Princess Niloufar and Dureshehvar, who were Turkish princesses who married the Nizam's 2 sons, Mufakham Jah and Mukarram Jah. So some of them were by marriage. and some of them were just pure love. And I'll come to you because of Sister Nivedita's very, very complex, multi-layered relationship, her love, her adoration for what she called her king. But that marriage, those men, those women who had these men, whether it was Suni Tata or whether it's Sonia Gandhi or whether it is Princess Niloufar and Dureshewar, what was the difference between that and those who did not have that male figure behind them?
All of them, to a certain extent, had to interact with male figures. Say, for example, Mother Teresa. Now, Mother Teresa is a controversial figure. I totally understand that. But she had an enormous thing that she had to do. In 1947, she took Indian citizenship. She took, well, in 1948, as soon as it was available to her. And during the period from 1947 to 1948, she managed to convince the Catholic Church in India, engaging with the Archbishop of Kolkata, Perrier, and then convinced him, which is absolutely amazing at this period, by using an anti-colonialist argument. She said, the nuns in our orders, in the Loreto order and the other order, they are being seen as mem-sahibs. She actually used that word. So she used that word in order to convince the Catholic hierarchy to found a new order. So it was always this interaction with the wider society, understanding that as a woman they are part of the wider society.
But did the women who had the men behind them, did they have a more powerful position, or it really didn't matter? That's the question. Then I'll come to...
Yeah, it didn't matter. It didn't matter.
Okay. So now I want to ask you about this very complex relationship between Sister Nivedita and her king, her master, Swami Vivekananda, who was, in a sense, there was definitely an element of love there. And we all have read stories of women who came from Europe, or we all know who fell in love with their mentors. But that love could never really reach any kind of a permanent relationship. So having said that, I think of that story of Vivekananda when he went to Amarnath cave and that whole experience. So can you talk about that? Because to me that is one of the most amazingly fascinating, the way you unravel that relationship.
Well, I think Nivedita was pretty unique, and sometimes she can't be slotted into any one structural mold. Yeah. Now, Nivedita came to India because she had heard Swami Vivekananda in London in one of his prayer meetings, and she convinced herself that she had to come to India, and her main purpose at that point of time was education, to educate child widows and women. But after she came to India, she found that the whole scenario was very different. There was paucity of funds for one, but she was trying to learn her India, and Vivekananda was of course her master. But in the early years, she was smitten by Vivekananda. She fell in love with him. So that's no secret. And my whole work is on the basis of letters, almost 1,000 of them. And in letters, you come to know things which you wouldn't otherwise. So she comes across as a flesh and blood person. So the Vivekananda that she adores when she comes and calls her king, then slowly becomes her master. And the book that she writes, The Master as I Saw Him. And then finally, in the last stages, she calls him her father. And so there is this transition in relationship. But I must say that it was not only Vivekananda that of course she calls herself Sister Nivedita of Vivekananda Ramakrishna. That was the identity she gave. But only 4 years she spent with Vivekananda. Vivekananda dies in 1902. She comes to India in 1898. And what was then her mission after? Her mission was something that she fashioned herself. So she became a person in her own right. And her project was not education. Her project was nationalism. This was Bengal during the anti-partition movement. It was the Swadeshi and the boycott. She got in touch with Congress leaders, worked with them. And so that was another Nivedita, another aspect of Nivedita, and which really fashioned her.
You know, I come back to her whole relationship with the Ramakrishna mission. I think that's very important. But before I do that, I want to ask you, Ian, here were these two since this particular session so much resonates with the subject of this conference, and Khushwant would have been very happy, soul somewhere would have been happy that we are discussing this session with all the women, and some of them like Princess Dureshehvar and Nilofer of Turkey, who married into Hyderabad. The most beautiful women, and you've got lovely photographs taken by world-famous photographers.
Margot,
so tell us something about that. Tell us something about these two Turkish princes who came into this very conservative mahal of Hyderabad, and then what transpired.
Yes, this links very much to Muhoti's presentation yesterday. These women were born into the Ottoman royal family. They were at a time when they grew up when Abdul Mesid II is the father of Dureshehvar. And so they grew up at a time and in great luxury and opulence. But they also experienced the pain of exile very, very soon afterwards. So they had to exile after Ataturk came to power. And there was this enormous thing. You can imagine the Abdul Mesid in a railway carriage moving towards the west, okay? And he's passing through Hungary. And this is, Philip Henscher says at this moment. And Abdul Mesid muses, though that point when he's moving through Hungary, he thinks, at this point, through these plains, my relatives came on horseback with swords, and here I am, in the night, like a shameful thief, being exiled and coming like a, sort of a shameful person. But one of the people who supported him and his family while they went to the west, and they actually ended in the south of France. And so one of the people who supported them was the Nizam of Hyderabad, actually bankrolled the Abdul Mesid's family. And therefore, Dureshehvar and Nilofer had a very, very cosmopolitan upbringing in the south. And
talk about the Tatars, the Sunni Tatar and the Simon Tatar.
Yeah. Sunni Tatar is a wonderful, wonderful woman. So she is the mother of J.R.D. Tatar, and she was born Suzanne Brière, and she changed, and she was born in Paris. And R.D. Tatar, so that's R.D. Tatar is J.R.D.'s father. He was actually in Paris at that time.
And Lakmi.
Yeah, and then this is that's another story. But just to focus in on Suzanne Brière, Sunni Tatar, for a moment. An absolutely a wonderful woman. She was the one who actually made sure that J.R.D. Tatar grew up with a cosmopolitan outlook, that he had his Western bilingualism of being able to speak English and also French, but also a type of Indian bilingualism of having some notions of what his Parsi heritage was, and also being, of course, a national figure as well.
Go ahead. And about
Simon Tatar, a rare figure as well, came from Switzerland, married Naval D. Tatar, and amazingly, she was expected just to be a wife at home. But what she did, she actually was interested in business, and Tata the Tata Oil Mills Company gave her the forum to start Lakme. And as you know, she sold Lakme Tata sold Lakme to Hindustani Lever for many, $85 million. So it was a very, very successful time that she spent. And she made cosmetics, Western style cosmetics, actually acceptable to a certain extent within Indian cultures. Obviously, cosmetics exist and existed before, but she made, because of the marketing strategy, she made them very acceptable.
So the important thing is that whereas Ian's book has these 9 women who stand very tall and are extremely important subjects of maybe further research, your book has the unique quality that you have really delved into Sister Nivedita through her letters. And what can be more authentic source than the letters also you came across in a very interesting way, in some kind of a kabadi bazaar or a bookshop where it was all moth-eaten and the white ants and everything. But talk about that and talk about the Ramakrishna mission, because that's another very important and a very multi-layered aspect of Sister Nivedita?
Well, I think Vivekananda had a certain, he had that generosity in his disposition to deal with Nivedita as his disciple, and also was very careful to keep the relationship impersonal, because he knew the adoration that his disciple had for him. So far as the monks of the Ramakrishna order were concerned, they were all celibate monks, and they were quite uncomfortable. And therefore, it's not a surprise that in 1902, after Vivekananda dies, Nivedita herself decides to leave the Ramakrishna order. And thereafter, she is on her own. And it's not, therefore, a surprise either that in none of the Ramakrishna Mission institutions do you find Nivedita's portrait. This is the 150th year. And she was, in many ways, the spokesperson of Vivekananda. It is through her writings that we know with lucidity what Vivekananda's teachings were all about, because they were vast, scattered, and often pretty contradictory, because he spoke to different audiences.
You know, Reba, I found it, sorry to interrupt you, but I found it so fascinating when you told us that she actually went into the Dakshineshwar temple and discoursed about Kali. I mean, the fact that a foreigner, a Videshni, could talk about Kali to a local audience. True, they were all elite Brahmo Samaj. But, and on the other hand, there was this Ramakrishna celibate monks who in a way really were very, standoffish, exactly, and keeping her away. So this kind of dichotomy, how did she deal with it?
She went to the Kalighat temple, not to Dakshineshwar, because Dakshineshwar was out of bounds to Vivekananda. When he returned, and this is the great irony, Vivekananda, who had realized his Kali as a disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, goes across the seas to Chicago and the world, and comes back and is denied access to Dakshineshwar. And so he tells his student, Nivedita was a remarkable student, the whole story of Kali. And Nivedita writes that she was at first appalled by this dark image, nude image of Kali with her protruding tongue standing on a supine Shiva. She was aghast until she was explained by Vivekananda what it meant, that this was Prakriti and Purush and Maya and all of that. So she then goes to Kalighat temple to give a whole lecture on Kali. And not only there, but also at the Royal Albert Hall in Kolkata. And her audience are all the erudite intelligentsia of Kolkata. And she is actually giving them a lecture on Kali, which is quite amazing.
Quite amazing. And your Videshnis, some of your Videshnis, unlike Sister Nivedita, jumped right into the politics. Any Besant. Do you want to say something about their political involvement?
Well, I think Annie Besant, I would like to speak maybe about their memorialization. There is someone who's very, very important, someone who is really forgotten in India, and that is Margaret Cousins. So there is obviously Margaret Noble, who became Nivedita, and Margaret Cousins. I wonder if anyone knows Margaret Cousins through the All India Women's Conference. And the only way that Margaret Cousins, she was the first female magistrate in India in the Madras presidency, and she was a founder member of a feminist movement in women's how can I say, movement for the promotion of women's rights, or long before the India achieved freedom. And I think Sister Nivedita has a stamp, and Mother Teresa maybe has too many stamps, but there is no stamp for Margaret Cousins. I would love to see Margaret Cousins have a stamp, India Post, to issue a stamp for her, and for her organization to campaign for that, because she had a very, very important influence. So these women all politics, because you couldn't buy...
And Sonia Gandhi is right there.
Yeah, Sonia Gandhi.
One of your favorite Videshnis. Am I right?
I think Sonia Gandhi will speak for herself, or she will be silent for herself. I think what I have done in the case of Sonia Gandhi is look at the polarization that has been very, very crucial in her public representation. And I try to show that both sides are inaccurate in the way that she is being presented. And what I have done is I focused on the few times during the introduction to, for example, commemorative volumes on Rajiv, where she has found her own voice. And she has been able to, I've looked at interviews, etc. And these marginalia, these documents where she speaks for herself, they are very, very few and far between.
Thank you so much. And with, this is very, to use a very right-on word, it's extremely Battamiz to get up and go in the middle of this discussion. But I'm going to visit my children and I have to go to Canada. So I could not resist being here because of my love for Khushwant ji and for this festival. So but I know that Reba is my old friend, colleague from many, many years, both Reba and Himachal. So we'll hand it over to you, Reba, and you have a wealth of information to share. Thank
you. Yes, both of them have flights to catch. So they are leaving me alone to hold the fort, but Nivedita is with me.
Rahul, go and sit on stage with Reba.
We're getting Rahul to sit on stage.
Okay.
So you're not left alone.
Gitanjali, how much time do I have? 8. Okay. Okay. So I'll quickly come to the second part of what I was talking about. Once she had exited the Ramakrishna order, then she gets into the nationalism project. And this is very important because her views on nation and nation making, and she writes about it and speaks about it, they have a lot of lessons for us today. And I just wanted to read a little bit from what she has written. And really they do tell us something about the times that we are in now. She says, "There will never be a solution unless the truth is grasped that the goal to be sought is in the great word nationality. Religion has never dwelt in a creed that divides man from man. It is in a religion that becomes a nation force that is the crying necessity for unity. If you want to know the real India, dream the dreams of Akbar and Ashoka. Patriotism is not learned in books. It is a feeling which seizes the whole being. It is at once the blood and the marrow. It is in the air one breathes and the sound one hears." This was Nivedita. And we spoke a little bit about her involvement in politics. And yes, she attended both the Congress sessions in 1905 and 1906. She also had her students design a flag which she had hoped to be the flag for India with a Vajra design in the middle. But most importantly, and of course she was always in conversation with Gokhale and with her book Kali the Mother inspired Sri Aurobindo. And I think I'll come to her legacy, which for me was the most important aspect of Nivedita, is her writings. 5 volumes. And in that, she traces, in the web of Indian life, she traces Indian society and how lovingly she writes about Indian society, about India's mythology, which is in her Cradle Tales of Hinduism, where she tries to find a parallel in Greek mythology or in the Nordic Icelandic tales. She tries to find a pattern in India's culture, which is so important. Then, of course, in The Master as I Saw Him, that's her work on Vivekananda, which is really a must-read to know what Vivekananda's teachings were about. And then her vast travels in India. She really traveled the length and breadth of the country in those times when travel was pretty primitive. And her writings are like a travel writing, which one can dip into, going to Badrinath and Kedarnath and all of that. But the aspect that finally I have to, we don't have too much time, that endeared me most to Nivedita, and this has really a reference to the theme of this LitFest, is her assertiveness, is her combativeness, is her confidence to enter male bastions on her own steam, not as a disciple of Vivekananda, but speaking for herself. Because she did interact with the great scientist Jagadish Chandra Bose, whom she adopted, although he was older than her, as her bairn, as she called him. And many of the manuscripts of Jagadish Chandra Bose were written by Nivedita. It was with Jagadish Chandra Bose and Abola Bose that she spent the last days in Darjeeling when she died. And to many people at the time, this combativeness and assertiveness made her seem almost like a crank. Many of the Europeans of the time thought she was a crank because she didn't live in the Chaurungi area of Calcutta, but she chose to live in North Calcutta with the most difficult living conditions, no fan, and she would often not find a maid to work for her. So she would wield the broom and sweep her own street in front of her house and so on and so forth. And she worked with the plague victims with her own hands, picked up the plague victims and brought them to herself to give them the healing touch in their last hours. All of this she did. But I think the one example that I can't resist sharing with you is her relationship with Rabindranath Tagore. Rabindranath Tagore, when she first came in, thought of her as a missionary, thought of her to be the ideal person who could teach his daughter English. So he approaches Sister Nivedita to teach his daughter English, to which she snaps back, saying, "How dare you? Why do you want to teach them English? It's a colonial language. What happened to your Bengali? Not at all. I will not teach them English. Please, please sort of dwell on your own culture." Now, Rabindranath had not expected this kind of thing. So over the years, he observed her. And then finally, there was a huge change of heart in him. When he realized what she was about, he invites her to Shilaidaho, which is in Bangladesh today, which is his riverine estate. And at that time, he was writing his novel Gora. And Nivedita comes, and he sort of spells out the whole theme of his novel Gora, which was in the making. And in this, of course, Gora is an Irish person who discovers his parentage at the last minute. And Gora is also in the nationalism project. And Gora gets to know Shucharita, who is of a Brahmo Samaj background. And the last bit of the story that Rabindranath has in mind is when Shucharita rejects the hand of Gora because he is a foreigner. And Nivedita hears this bit and she's livid. She says, "You are demeaning Indian womanhood. How could you do that?" And Rabindranath changes the ending of Gora. And in the last scene of Gora, there is Shucharita extending her hand to Gora. And that's how the novel ends. And Rabindranath acknowledges this in his letter to Pearson, where he says, "I changed the ending because of Nivedita." And so at the end, through this tumultuous relationship between Rabindranath and Nivedita, when Nivedita dies, he writes her obituary in an article called Bhogini Nivedita, and I've translated that, and I'll just read just 4 lines. He called her Lok Mata, the people's mother. One had to respect her not because she was a Hindu, but because she was an outstanding human being. One had to salute her not for being like the rest of us, but being better than us. She could claim pride from all, not because of her Hindutva, but because of her humanism. So I think I'll end there. Any questions? I think we have a little time.
You can ask.
Mike.
Please tell us the Amarnath episode.
Okay, that's true. I will if I am given a minute.
Thank you. That was a fascinating session, and I actually have a comment that reflects on the beginning, where Syeda ji had said that there were sort of 2 models, as it were, of Videshnis. Those who were, or perhaps she hadn't said it, but it emerged, that those who were supported by men, in a sense, through their life in India, and those who somehow struck out on their own, like Sister Nivedita. And I just wanted to point out a third sort of extension of these models, which was Alice Boner, who was a Swiss a woman who lived in Benares. And she came to India because she was fascinated by Uday Shankar and came to Almora and so on and ended up in Benares. But she actually had a relationship where she was the mentor to Uday Shankar and his troupe in Europe. So in a sense, it was a kind of a balanced relationship. Yes.
Thank you for that observation. I'll just touch briefly on Amarnath because that is a very poignant moment. It was a moment of epiphany. So she accompanies Vivekananda to Amarnath, to the Amarnath cave. She's the only one to do that. And she writes again in these letters that she saw Vivekananda in a moment of almost of trance when he is in front of the Shivalingam. And she wants to be part of that spiritual experience. She wants him to almost touch her like Ramakrishna had touched Vivekananda and it got into Samadhi. So she wanted that inclusiveness. But instead of that, she found Vivekananda very distant. And that hurt her a lot. But what was very important is, I think, Vivekananda then realized the adoration of this woman and realized he changes tack, you know. It was Shiva, Shiva, Shiva all along. And then after Amarnath experience, he says, Mother, Mother, Mother. And he puts the woman on a pedestal. So she's a mother, she's a sister, beyond sexual attraction, really. And that was a safe space for the woman from which he could, respect the divinity in a woman and keep personal relationships at bay. This is what actually happened.
Gentleman was walking along with his girlfriend when they passed a jewelry shop. On display was a large solitaire which caught her eye, and she cajoled him to buy it. He replied, "Extenuating circumstances preclude me from acquiring a bauble of such extravagance." Puzzled, she replied, "I don't get it." He smiled and said, "Precisely." "Mr. Tharoor, you must have guessed it's you. Please come to the stage." Rajiv Mehrotra, please come to the stage. Rajiv is the interlocutor of the session. Rajiv and Shashi will talk about Shashi's book, Why I Am a Hindu. We all know of Dr. Tharoor's usage of the Queen's English, but not many of us know that he has an interest in English. In fact, he was the one who invented the word prepone as long ago as 1972. Shashi is a politician, a former career diplomat, and currently chairman of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs. Rajiv Mehrotra is a writer, TV producer, documentary filmmaker, and a personal student of the Dalai Lama, for whom he manages the Foundation for Universal Responsibility. So this session is called Tharoorism on Hinduism.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to a very special moment for me personally. Shashi is one of my oldest friends, and we haven't done this on stage for many, many years. Shashi, Tharoorism. You've just been introduced as Tharoorism and Hinduism. Aren't these isms a liability?
I don't think this mic is. Sorry about that. Yes, well, I think they're going to get you a new one. Thank you, and great to see you all here, and what a gorgeous day and wonderful, splendid setting. And as Rajiv said, he's one of my oldest friends, so that gives him the entire liberty to take the mickey out of me for the next hour. But yeah, you know, we've done various interviews. In fact, I think the first time that Rajiv and I appeared together in a public event was when he ran a quiz show on Doordarshan. And I was a freshman at St. Stephen's College in 1972. And I still remember it was a quiz contest against Jesus and Mary College. And at one point, Rajiv, as the very efficient compere, said, you know, the two teams are neck to neck. And for some reason turned to me, whereupon I said, it's a pleasure to be neck to neck with the girls of Jesus and Mary, which I could never do today in the new Me Too era. But Doordarshan censored went out there, the scandal of 72. But anyway, good to see you, Rajiv.
Well, Shashi's playing safe because he knows that there's no way I'm going to take the mickey out of him. The question was about Tharoorism.
Well, you know, I mean, the thing, I don't know who comes up with these terms. I certainly didn't give them that topic, shall we say. All I can say is that it's amusing. I mean, there are apparently a band of people on social media who call themselves Tharoorians. There are words that are being dubbed as Tharoorisms. And after a while, one sort of just plays along with the joke. I mean, I have no real pretensions to being a great savant of the language or whatever, but I enjoy using the language. And if, as a result, some expressions capture people's attention, so be it. I actually turned it around just a couple of days ago when I had to announce the publication of my next book. And I thought book announcements are a dime a dozen. How do we grab the attention of people? So I deliberately used an ultra-long word. I said my next book, The Paradoxical Prime Minister, is more than just an exercise in floxinosinhilipilification, which happens to mean the act of estimating something or someone as worthless. So I wanted to say, don't assume the book just merely says that our present Prime Minister is worthless. There is more to it than that, so read the book. And I gather pre-orders did pretty well after that. So you see, Tharoorisms can work as a marketing strategy.
Well, looking at Hinduism, have you sort of avoided the phrase ism from the title of your book?
You know, it's a good question because obviously there are many sort of people who get quite worked up about things like even the name Hinduism. As you know, Hinduism, the word Hindu doesn't actually occur in any of our ancient texts. The first recorded usage of it by a Hindu is somewhere around the 14th century. Hindu was the term that foreigners gave to what they saw as the indigenous religions of the people of India, those who lived beyond the Indus. Hindu, the Greeks used it, the Persians used it. To this day, many French people of a certain generation, the word for Indian for them is Hindu and not Indien, which is the new form, Hindu rather than Indian. So there's been this confusion or conflation, if you like. And so many people of a certain conservative disposition say Hinduism is a completely Western construct, speak of Sanatan Dharma and so on, and you could do that if you wish. But since this is a term that we have taken on for self-definition for centuries, it seemed a bit precious to. So I actually speak of Hinduism throughout the book, though not in the title. And though it's there throughout the book, I find it useful to speak of Hinduism in contradistinction to Hindutva, which to my mind has nothing to do with religion and is a purely political ideology.
You have argued that in the history of Hinduism, that this is the most a time of the most serious challenge to Hinduism, and I think it's quite a challenge to briefly, and your book does that very eloquently, to try and articulate what is Hinduism, who is a Hindu, and that's a long discussion, and maybe we'll just bypass that for now at least. Why do you feel that at this point, historically, when you had Buddhism, you had Ramon Roy, you had a zillion influences that, in a sense, created ripples within Hinduism, and Hinduism recovered the richer. Whether it was the Islamic the invasions, it was the British in India, and you see an internal threat, and seem to struggle and worry about its future, and also in a sense the positioning of the book is really a response to create an alternative discourse to this threat.
That's right. I mean, you're quite right that Hinduism has already been challenged many times in the last few thousand years, going back to Buddhism, Jainism, Islam, Christianity. There have been various reform movements, many of which I have discussed in the book, if not in extensive detail, because the idea of the book is that it should be accessible and digestible. But the first half nonetheless lays out what I consider to be the essential elements of Hinduism. And I do think that one of the fundamental things about Hinduism is that there are no fundamentals. We have no single sacred book. We have many. We have no single, we have no pope or sanctified ecclesiastical hierarchy or one fount of religious or scriptural authority. We have many. We don't even have a Sunday, because you can worship on all 7 days of the week and observe any one day as more special than the other 6, depending on who you dedicate your worship to. So it's an extraordinarily eclectic faith from the planet that I'm aware of that allows for such diversity of interpretation and practice as Hinduism. And to my mind, that is its essence and its great strength. Because I mean, somebody who is a sort of self-confessed Vivekanand Bhakt. I am somebody who, as a teenager, remember reading his famous addresses to in the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 1893, in which something he said really stuck with me, and I've been sort of mulling over it ever since, which is when he said in Chicago that, I speak to you on behalf of religion, which has taught the world not just tolerance but acceptance. And to my mind, that was a very interesting idea, and the more I thought about it, the more profound it seemed, because I went to school, as I'm sure kids today still do, learning that tolerance is a virtue, that ultimately tolerance is a good thing, a tolerant king is a good king because he accommodates others who believe different things from him, and so on. But when you think about it, as clearly Vivekananda had, tolerance is ultimately a rather patronizing idea. Because tolerance says, I have the truth, you are unanimously right to be wrong. Whereas what Vivekananda says Hinduism is all about is not just tolerance, but acceptance. Acceptance says, I believe I have the truth, you believe you have the truth, I will respect your truth, please respect my truth. And to my mind, this is so fundamental to the explaining the success, the survival, the resilience, the reinvention, the repeated rejuvenation of Hinduism over 3,000 or 4,000 years, that it seemed to me that anything that claimed to be Hindu but that fundamentally moved away from these precepts is actually anti-Hindu. And that's why I find that Hindutva, with its narrow exclusionary bigotry, is a violent assault on the basic tenets of what every Hindu should be brought up to believe is precious about his faith.
I think the challenge of multiple truths is it opens up the possibility that my truth and your truth, but they're still truths. And I think there are several groups and segments and religious communities who need the certitude of their truth. So how does a philosophy that is embracing of diverse truths, and I just want to take a minute to take that further and point out, I think one of the few significant things that your book missed on the Vivekananda Ramakrishna tradition was that Ramakrishna was a temple pujari, just a priest in a small temple, and revered as an avatar. And here was someone who went out from the temple precincts and not widely reported. It's something that I think both sides of the spectrum, the liberals and the right wing in a sense, tend to neglect, is that here was a man who went out and built a cottage and engaged in the life, the rituals of a Muslim, of Islam. And when I was doing a biography of Ramakrishna, and I said he ate beef, and the only comment that the Ramakrishna mission had was, well, could you not mention beef and just say he ate the diet of a Muslim? He did this with Christianity, he did it with Sikhism. In his own spiritual journey, he engaged in the practices, the lived experience of the different traditions of Tantra, of Advait and Dvait. So here was a man who was actually engaging, living experientially diverse truths and learning from them. So what I wanted to say was that it actually goes beyond acknowledging the other person's truth, but really saying, can I learn from your truth? But how is that able to accommodate, philosophically, someone who needs the certitude of his truth?
Well, Vivekananda's answer is that it doesn't really matter. I mean, he used to love quoting the Shiva Mahimna Stotram, which says that just as different rivers flow in different directions, straight or crooked, to the same sea, so also all modes of worship ultimately lead to the one, we would say Brahman, the divine spirit that suffuses the cosmos. And since, therefore, your truth is one way of getting there, and my truth is another way of getting there, why quarrel?
But I think that throws in...
It's only different ways of getting there. It's not fundamentally, doesn't change the reality of what is around us.
But that assumes that you and I agree on the reality that we aspire to. So, for example, we've done some work with people who are dying. And so the question comes up, what reassurances, what do you say to people who are dying? So a Muslim who's confronting death is aspiring to reach something completely different to sort of the Hindu understanding or the Christian one. So I don't want to sort of quibble on this, but it was really to try and understand that when we try and look at Hindutva, that Hindutva's need for a kind of certitude is inherently contradictory to the inclusive idea that you're talking about and the diversity.
Which is why I see Hindutva has very little to do with Hinduism. In fact, the man who came up with the concept of Hindutva, V.D. Savarkar, in the 1920s, actually wasn't much of a believer. Wasn't a temple goer, wasn't at all immersed in Hindu spirituality. He was actually the product of a certain global current in the 1920s, which was not very different from the kind of thinking that lay behind the fascist movement in Italy, the Nazi movement in Germany, the similar movements in Portugal and Spain, because there was a certain global tendency at that point to think in terms of ethnic, or as they used to call it, race pride. And it's very revealing that Savarkar speaks of Hindus as a race. He repeatedly writes about Hindu pride in terms of race pride as a sort of identity. And for him, the Hindu culture and therefore the Hindu identity is what he seeks to preserve in the face of what he sees as a Muslim, Christian and other onslaught. Now this idea is very much an idea built on a perception of inferiority, of conquest, of subjugation, of humiliation. It has nothing to do with the soaring majesty of the Upanishadic inquiry or the philosophical questions about the spirituality and the cosmos and Vivekananda saying, Ekam Sad Vipra Bahudavadanti, one truth, but the sages call it by different names. None of that. Their truth was a very narrow, particularly politically focused truth, devised in a certain global climate in which equivalent forms of political messaging and political organization were being tried in other parts of Europe as well. It's no accident. I describe in the book how an extraordinary sort of half Greek, half Irish, whatever, Nazi shows up from Europe and attaches herself to Savarkar. And Savarkar writes an introduction to her book in which she starts now telling the Hindus to be, more proud of their race and assert themselves against others. So it's a particular phenomenon. Now the phenomenon died out pretty much everywhere else in the world. It was defeated in the Second World War, so the Nazis and the fascists went. Then the Spanish and the Portuguese lasted till the 70s, and that was that. There isn't really an equivalent movement anywhere, except somehow in India. It sprung into life in the 1980s after having lain not quite dormant, active, but below the radar for quite some time.
So the challenge really is that how do we address this? And of course through the political process, through political activism, but the manner in which it is penetrating people's consciousness, this contrarian point of view perspective to the what we believe to be the umbrella, the inherent celebration of diversity. In fact, I prefer to tolerance or acceptance, a celebration of diversity.
Diversity and pluralism have been my preferred words to even the sort of hallowed secularism idea, because actually we are not secular in the Western dictionary sense of the term at all. You open any dictionary and it talks about secularism as the absence of religion or distancing from religion.
But I want to hold you to this.
Whereas pluralism is what we're all about, where we encourage a profusion and the flourishing of religions. But sorry, go on.
No. I was just going to say, so what is the kind of response that Hinduism can offer, that Hinduism can create, that we can generate to counter this? Beyond, of course, the electoral process. But what are the elements? What are the structures that Hinduism has to offer? What do we, as Hindus or Sikhs or people who belong to an inclusive culture, do to be able to resist what seems like a juggernaut?
So, obviously there are many levels of response possible. Mine attempts to be one, which is, if you like, a sort of reclaiming of the ground intellectually. I don't claim any spiritual competence, but a reclaiming of the intellectual ground for this more inclusive, liberal understanding of Hinduism, which I'm gratified by the number of people in the years since the book's been published who come up to me, complete strangers, saying, you speak for me because this is the way I'd really felt about my faith, but I couldn't put it in words until you did it for me. So, to my mind, just reminding Hindus that this is what they feel ought to be all about. Some people have very generously credited me for the somewhat startling speeches by Mohan Bhagwat just last month, in which he tried to, in some ways, to appropriate this more liberal idea of Hinduism and incorporate it into a sort of redefinition of Hindutva. It'll be very interesting to see how far that goes with the RSS. But as I said, Hindutva is a political ideology. It has a political agenda, and it seeks to serve the political interests of some Hindus who happen to believe certain things, and usually from a certain set of castes. Whereas the Hinduism I talk about, which is much broader, much more inclusive, and much more all-embracing, needs some assertion. Hindutva between Hindus and godless secularists. Because kind of syllogism, the godless secularists will always lose. Since you say you're secular, what gives you a right to tell us about Hindus? So I thought it was important that as a believing Hindu, I could argue from within the framework of the religion and say, no, this is a quarrel between two different understandings of Hinduism, and frankly yours is much less grounded in the lived experience of Hinduism, the texts of Hinduism, the diversity of Hinduism, than mine is.
Well, I was proposing that merely the discourse at the level of ideas may not be enough.
And some activism will be needed.
Some form of activism and what that might take. But I'm going to change the track of the conversation a little bit to your personal journey as a Hindu. And in your everyday life and living, as you confront challenges, and you confront many of them, as many of us do. So what aspects of the Hindu faith, the tradition, some of the familiar ideas like karma, let's talk about karma. How does the philosophy of the idea of karma give you strength, comfort, wisdom? To engage?
It does all of that simply because, I link it to the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita, which essentially says that you must do your duty without expectation of reward. And obviously, nobody is that selfless. They do have a reward in mind, but the insight it gives me is that the reward is not the only justification for the effort. You may fail, and I have failed, to win some of the rewards that my striving was intended to accomplish. But if in the process of that striving I have done what I consider to be the right thing, and because it is my sense of duty, I'm fulfilling my dharma. And that kind of action, that kind of service, is something that I believe constitutes karma. When you look at life generally, in fact, Hinduism as a whole has many ways in which you can try and practice your connection to the divine, as it were. There is Bhakti Yoga, the worship, the going to temples, the prayers, the rituals, all of that stuff. There is Jnana Yoga, the reading. I've done much more of the latter than the former. Just read as much as you can and use your intellectual powers to understand the philosophies. There's Raja Yoga, which is completely meditative and looking inside you. The whole idea that in many religions you look to the heavens to find God, whereas a Hindu looks for God within himself. So that is also there. And then finally you've got the Karma Yoga, which is really searching ultimately for the divine connection through service. And I think many of us do it without perhaps putting that particular label on it. But just service to one's fellow human beings, trying to make a difference around the world, is also a way of fulfilling your dharma on the planet.
Well, you've experienced, you're in politics, you experience, and you have experienced, not just as a politician, but as a human being, say injustice, false accusation.
Absolutely.
And a whole gamut of challenges and struggles. So, I mean, what you've recounted are the sort of, the four archetypes that Swami Vivekananda, we'll come to that, but how do you process these on an everyday basis? I know you pray, you have a small temple in your garden, you have a shrine in your home, but how do you intellectually process this, accept it, and keep moving on with a kind of amazing energy? Shashi took a late night flight from Trivandrum to Delhi, early morning, Delhi to Chandigarh to Kasauli, and 1:30 back to Delhi to somewhere else.
Chennai tomorrow morning.
Chennai, and I know that this is a sort of a kind of level of engagement that you sustain. And you're a prolific writer. And what are these qualities? I mean, forget these archetypes, forget the philosophy. What do you do for yourself? What do you say to yourself? What practices do you do that give you this determination, this energy to carry on and keep smiling?
I honestly don't know, because it comes instinctively to a great extent. It isn't sort of a learned habit. I think it's partly because if you have faith in yourself and in something larger than yourself, that's probably all the motivation most of us should need. I mean, I was never motivated by many of the conventional yardsticks of contemporary life. Rupee figures at the bottom of an account sheet was never something that motivated me right from college days. I find that, and I'm not sort of driven by this relentless quest for power that some people are, I do want to make a difference. And if I can make a difference through my words, through my writing ideas, fine. If I can do service, fine. If I can do it just by being good to another human being, that's fine too. And I'll try and do all of those things without being very self-conscious, part of who you are. I think George Bernard Shaw once, why he wrote it for the same reason a cow gives milk. I mean, if it's inside you, it's got to come out. And you'd probably be in real pain if it didn't. And that's ultimately, and you are the person you are. You can't help being that person. And you'd probably be in pain if something prevented you from being that person. That's probably the closest I can get to a decent answer.
Mm-hmm. You have written about how Hinduism is sort of potentially a global, potentially a global religion, a global framework that could bring diverse communities together around the world. One of the areas that your book hasn't delved, I feel enough, because that certainly is an area of my interest, is the tremendous heritage of mind training. Amongst our greatest exports is then yoga and Buddhism. And today you have a very large category of people who describe themselves as friends of Buddhism, or who practice yoga, albeit without going into the total set of nuances that it involves, but as things that they can learn from. And so there is that, and much of it has been, how do I put it, validated in terms of the Western vocabulary of reason and logic and understanding, more empirical aspect, and has been able to reconcile faith and devotion to a more rational, logical effort. What kind of practices do you follow that convert or help transform what are intellectual insights and philosophical insights and illuminations into the deepest reflexive responses as human beings? So we may recognize that we shouldn't get angry, or we shouldn't gossip, or any of all the wonderful virtues.
I can see where you're driving, Raj. Even have to admit that I'm utterly hopeless at yoga. I would probably look even worse than Narendra Modi if I tried to practice it. It really. I've tried. Believe me, I've actually I've tried on several occasions, and each time managed to make myself feel like a thorough chump, and I've never been able to persist with it. So physical practice, I haven't. I tried to learn meditation, found my mind was far too restless and refused to be curbed. So I'm actually a pretty bad practitioner of these techniques, which is why I sort of take refuge in Jnana Yoga. I read widely, I try and understand what I've read and try and replicate it. In fact, it's a good question, because I know for many Hindus the experience of anchoring themselves to those practices is what actually channels their faith. I can't say that I've had that.
And in terms of your own political aspirations, as a member of the Congress Party, have you ever felt, well, maybe an unfair question to ask this of you in public, but do you feel contrarian impulses at the human level and the demands of politics?
I think it's a fair question. I mean, I'm, for example, a fairly short-lived spokesman for the party, because my instincts were not always the party's instincts, and I was divested of that responsibility pretty swiftly. But that actually is the right thing for me, because I do have independent opinions, which I am reluctant to curb. The one thing I think politics has obliged me to do sometimes is not to express them. So I will never lie to you. I will never say the opposite of what I believe merely because the party expects me to. But I will, for the sake of party loyalty, bite my tongue when the party takes a stand I disagree with, or when the party expects a certain line to please the voters, and that doesn't happen to be my conviction. And that's part of the price you pay in politics. You do have to be attentive to the collective interests of the party with the electorate. And I must say that to my mind, it's very difficult to escape that as a politician. But I don't allow that to sort of pollute the perception of my convictions as a writer. So there'll be some issues on which people may say, well, why haven't you said anything? And I may just try and duck the question, but there'll be some issues on which I can speak with conviction and enthusiasm in the same direction as the party, because I'm in the party since broadly we share a certain congruence of vision for what's good for the country and where the country should be going.
Yesterday we had a very engaging session with Gurcharan Amma, and your
I've been at Gurcharan's launch,
and people swoon over you. And I've actually, I've been at a function in Calcutta where Shashi was speaking, and there was this young lady in the audience who didn't want him to put down his bottle of water so that she can come and drink of it. And so that's sort of extreme.
And she actually did at the end of that.
Yes. And so I was going to ask you.
This one before.
I'm going to ask you how you relate to karma and its great sort of space in India's civilizational heritage, something that your book studiously and rigorously avoids talking about.
Absolutely. In fact, I think the Kama Sutra may be mentioned in the book, but perhaps only once. I left this to the experience and wisdom of Gurcharan to write an entire book about it. Look, I mean, I think one thing that's important that Gurcharan also makes clear in his book is that ancient Hindu thought simply accepted karma as one of the four natural sort of elements in every human life, that karma, artha, moksha, and of course, when you look at artha, it is essentially material goods. It is also a desire for wealth that is sanctified in Hinduism, which makes us, in some ways, not necessarily instinctive socialists. And when it comes to karma, it's an acknowledgement that human beings have a need to love and be loved and to have sex and in that process to procreate. And I think that's a fairly healthy acknowledgement that these are all parts of a normal human life. In fact, one of the peculiar impacts of British colonialism was that it happened during the Victorian era, when such things were constantly being repressed, even in Victorian England, where piano legs could not be mentioned because they were legs, you see. So they had to be covered up. Piano legs were covered in Victorian England. Now, in that kind of culture, coming and ruling a culture where we had actually been very comfortable with ideas of human sexuality. I think they distorted it in many ways, have left a still lasting impress on the minds, habits and hypocrisies of our people.
Well, your book didn't get as badly slammed by the right wing as many of us expected.
Actually, it was a very interesting thing. I learned from two sources, now they may or may not be accurate, that there was actually a directive within the RSS not to engage in a debate on my book. Now, there are two possible explanations. Either they found they couldn't refute me, or they felt that arguing with me would only draw more attention to my arguments, and that would not do them a favor. But it is interesting. It's very striking. There were a couple of reviews. There was a nasty review in The Organizer, but nobody other than RSS cadres reads that. There is a magazine that has sadly sort of traduced the name of Rajaji's fine liberal publication, Swarajya, has become a sort of RSS BJP mouthpiece. They, oddly enough, ran not one but two reviews, both nasty. But again, it didn't quite ignite a storm of controversy. In fact, I got my biggest criticisms from the left, because Kancha Ilaya sort of made a cottage industry of writing reviews in different publications, all accusing me for not having sufficiently denounced Hindu caste practices. I believe I have. I believe I've addressed the issue of caste. I have talked about my own personal feelings about it. I've also talked about some of the views of others in a length which may not be great, but which is in proportion to the rest of the treatment of the Hindu religion, I thought adequate. Obviously, he disagreed, and others may disagree. I mean, there'll always be in a book like this, you can read 10 volumes on Hinduism and still not exhaust how much can be said. So to read a book of about 300 pages in which about 150 just actually try and describe and go into all the issues of the faith, you're bound to feel that some things are not treated as fully as you'd like. I will plead guilty as charged, but I wanted to read a book that write a book that people would actually read.
Well, we're going to open up the floor. We have about 10 minutes. The first hand that went up.
Shashi, why are you wearing BJP colors? Something going on?
Actually, it's one of the colors of my party as well as the national flag. So I refuse to cede this beautiful Indian color to one particular party that doesn't deserve to wear it.
There's a lady at the back.
I think there's a schoolgirl right over there.
Yes.
But somebody's going around with a mic, or you have to shout?
Thank you for taking my question. You said that rather than having a single archaic figure in Hinduism, like a lot of other groups have, how does that leeway allow people to stray away from misinterpretations that will ultimately lead them to use them as a personal agenda?
Well, the fact is it doesn't actually shield you from that, which is why we have so many godmen around and gurus of various sorts. You are encouraged to find your own truth. I write about how as a child I used to watch my father pray every single day after his shower, his wet hair still uncombed, draped in a towel, but he never once obliged me to join him. The essential Hindu idea is you find your own truth, and you find it through your own way. I mean, paths can be shown to you, temples can be shown to you, books can be shown to you. You find your truth. And if you choose then to go attach yourself to a guru who misinterprets, as you say, but except that Hindu would say there's no misinterpretation, there are various interpretations, and you choose that which seems right to you. So if indeed 20 million people think that, what's his name, Guru Ram Rahim Singh is actually the right interpreter of the scriptures, those 20 million people, their own worship sanctifies that belief, whether or not you or I may think it was a silly thing to believe. So that's again part of the flexibility and eclecticism of the faith.
I think a sort of a corollary to that is the recognition through a process of empiricism, reason and logic today. For example, quantum theory will tell us the very presence of an observer changes the nature of reality, changes truth. So that enables, I think, our heritage to acknowledge that there are diverse truths, not merely as strategies for us to find truths that are relevant and appropriate for us. The second thing that does is, certainly in the Buddhist dialectic tradition, and Shashi mentions in his book, that how in Hinduism we are encouraged sometimes to hold two seemingly contradictory truths with a quality of lightness, looking at how we can learn from each of them. So this whole notion of an ultimate truth and a relative functional truth is a very important seminal dimension of our civilizational heritage. Sorry, I jumped in. Next question.
I'd like to ask a question.
Yes, please, madam.
Hello.
Yes, if we can hear you.
So, you're talking about Hinduism. It's a religion. Religion, I think, the purpose of religion is leading people to happiness. And I'm very convinced what Mr. Tharoor is saying, that, as he says, I go for Gyan, because Gyan Yoga, because he can't find anything very strong to anchor to and to find the solutions, maybe whatever troubles him. So he's into Gyan Yoga. The same, I'm a Hindu, and I also couldn't find anything which I could anchor to. So the purpose of life, everything is so much in despair, people into depressions. What does Hinduism say? What should we anchor to? Do we have anything sustainable, something serious we can anchor to, which can give us hope when we are totally into despair?
Gosh, that's such a vast question. You're almost putting me in the position of some sort of spiritual guru who are giving you life lessons.
But you're writing a book on our religion, that's why I'm asking.
No, well, I think the Hindu answer would be do your dharma, which may not be his dharma or her dharma. Do what you think is the right way of living, that will do no harm to others, and that at the same time will help you fulfill your purpose and lead you in a direction towards the ultimate union of your soul, your Atman, with the Brahman. Now, I've explained this in a little more detail in the book. If you're saying, how does that give me consolation in all the troubles in life? It may or may not do so, because one of the interesting things about Hinduism is that it embraces good and bad in one. God is present everywhere. As Radhakrishnan explained, we really don't have a genuine concept of hell, because hell would imply the existence of a place where God is not. And for Hinduism, that's impossible, because God is everywhere and everything. God is right here. The divine spirit suffuses the entire cosmos. It's in that tree, it's in you, it's in me, it's here, it's right now while we're sitting and speaking, and it'll be in any negative and suffering that you have as well. So that even if negatives happen in your life, the ideas of Hindu philosophy essentially do a better job of reconciling you to that suffering than most other philosophies or religions I've read. Because, if you do believe in an all-merciful, bountiful God, it's very difficult to understand why he should inflict suffering, injustice, disease, illness, and tragedy upon you. Whereas Hinduism says that's all part of God.
That's karma.
And so if you were to try and look at the purpose of your life, the ultimate purpose to a Hindu is beyond the circumstances of this life. In many faiths, the body has a soul. In Hinduism, the soul has a body. And the soul is permanent, the body is something that it's in temporary occupation of. When the present purpose is served, the body will be shed, but the soul will continue and go on to a future body. Or maybe not, depending on whether it's actually attained moksha. Now, these philosophical ideas give you a sense of perspective, but if you don't mind, there are a few passages in the book that may help answer your question in more detail than we can in the time available. Do read the book.
Thank you, Mr. Tharoor.
Sorry, if I could just add to that. I think what Shashi's really saying is, and I'm going to take the liberty of saying what, is that when we speak of the four archetypes, the Karma Yogi, the Bhakta Yogi, and the Raj Yogi, and what have you, is that Swami Vivekananda was defining four archetypes. And they're just archetypes, which means that we are all a combination of these. And so if we need to identify, and if I can explain it in a different way, that each one of us needs a different mental diet, just like we need a physical diet. So the challenge for each one of us is to find which of these archetypes, a combination of archetypes, suits our temperament, our needs, and who we are. And then approach the insights and solutions to our predicaments through that particular path. And a truly enlightened teacher will help you identify that particular journey. So that is the nature of the path of Hinduism. And these are just four archetypes. There are innumerable shades and nuances that follow from it. Next question. Yes. Well, we'll take Rahul Singh and then the young man at the back.
Can an atheist or an agnostic
be a good Hindu?
The question is, can an atheist or an agnostic be a good Hindu? And the answer is yes. Because amongst the many schools of Hindu philosophy are explicitly schools that both talk about atheism and agnosticism. And there is a school of philosophy, the Charvakas, are not only agnostic but also materialist, who say the entire purpose of life is to make as much artha as you possibly can, and who are quite cynical, really, about the pretensions to divinity and spirituality of others. So Hindu philosophy is truly the most extraordinarily wide range of ideas imaginable. And indeed, when you speak about agnosticism, it actually goes to the, I would say, the foundational precepts of Hinduism. In the Rig Veda, there is the Nasadiya Sukta, the creation hymn, which is a wonderful hymn. I've quoted a few verses from it in the book. And the last verse says, so where did all this come from? Who made all this all? Who created this universe? Only He in the heavens knows. Or maybe even He does not know. I mean, a religion that actually questions even the omniscience of the omnipresent one is, to my mind, a religion that respects the idea of doubt and incertitude. In fact, for the first 1,000 years or so, Hinduism had a notion of God very much like Islam, which is the Nirguna Brahman. Brahman is the spirit that suffuses the world, but a Brahman without qualities. Certainly no shape, no form, no gender. So God wasn't a he. But the sages realized that human beings needed something more. During the Vedic years, people were busy worshipping rivers and mountains and trees and so on. And so in their wisdom, they came up with the idea of the Saguna Brahman, God with qualities. That's when ideas of Bhagwan and Ishwar start entering Hindu discourse. But even then, they said, since nobody's really seen God, no one has any accurate idea of what God looks like, you are free to imagine God as you see fit. And that's why we have the 330 million images of the divine. Because if for you want to worship God as a pot-bellied figure with an elephant head, that's fine. You want to worship God as an 8-armed woman riding a tiger, that's fine too. And actually, by that same logic, if you want to worship God as a bleeding man suffering on a cross, that is also acceptable to them. Because the point is, all of these are merely crutches for our limited human imagination to reach out to that which we cannot otherwise touch or attain. That is ultimately so. If you say, I'm an agnostic because you can't prove to me that God exists, the Hindu will say, fine. Quite right. Be an agnostic. We are not sure that there is a God in the sense that, say, she thinks there is, or that he thinks there is. But the fact is, there is this divine spirit. Ultimately, we're all going to be trying to merge into it. You find your own way of living. And if you choose, if you want to have some symbol, some image, some idea, by all means, channel your energies, your quest for the divine through that symbol. And if you don't, that's fine too.
But there's a corollary to that question. And that is, what if he doesn't, in his aspiration, there is no one to merge with?
Well, you'll find out. We'll all find out.
That's what he's really saying. That, look, I mean, okay.
And the young man has
yes, at the back.
I have a small comment to make.
Wait. There's that young student in a red jacket, and then we'll come forward. Right. Yes. One of you, please, and then we'll move forward.
Good morning, sir.
Yes.
Sir, you said that Hinduism is a combination of acceptance and tolerance. So I would like to ask you that, to what extent do you believe that intolerance has crept into this ideology, and what impact it has on the current political landscape?
No, unfortunately, intolerance has been part of human nature, and therefore there have been intolerant Hindus, just as there have been intolerant people of other faiths in different times and periods of history. I don't think that being a Hindu makes you magically immune to human weakness and prejudice and bigotry and hatred and all of those things. It's just that the religion doesn't actually encourage or sanctify it. As I said, Hindutva is actually a political ideology. Intolerance is built into it because Hindutva rests on the principle that those who are not Hindus should not benefit from the world and the country that it seeks to create in the name of Hindus. And therefore, it's difficult for anyone who understands the principles of acceptance and inclusiveness in Hinduism to accept that Hindutva is in any way a doctrine that's connected to Hinduism. It is not. It has nothing to do with Hinduism in terms of Hindu spirituality, Hindu philosophy, Hindu beliefs. It has chosen instead to reduce this sort of magnificent, diverse, soaring, majestic faith into something much more like the identity politics or the identity practices of the British football hooligan. I don't know if you're a fan of British football, but these guys going around saying, my team is the best, and if you don't agree with me, I'll hit you on the head with my, supporting placard. I mean, that's essentially what these people are trying to do. Hinduism has to be much more than the identity doctrine that Hindutva has sought to bring it down to.
Well, a Tharoorism in the book is that there is a consensus, there need not be a consensus. I'm just going to ask another question. And you've written in the book that you're a Hindu because you were born one.
I think that's the most obvious answer, but then I go on the next 150 pages to explain why.
That is to explain why you stayed a Hindu, all right? You've also quoted David Frawley, who's called for more affirmative, activist Hinduism. How did David Frawley become a Hindu?
So there is a process of conversion through the Arya Samaj, Shuddhikaran, which is actually an interesting invention. Dayanand Saraswati is one of the more interesting characters in the various 19th century reform movements, because he clearly had a complex that the British had instilled upon him. I'm sorry I'm saying this, and not far from where he was active and preached in Punjab. But the idea of Dayanand was really, ideas of Dayanand were very influenced by the sort of insult he felt that the British had such contempt for Hinduism. So that's why he moved away from idol worship, because the British Christians thought that idol worship was an inferior form of worship, and so he said, no, it's not essential to Hinduism. The British wanted a Bible to respect. So what did Dayanand Saraswati do? He eliminated all the sacred texts except the Vedas and said, the Vedas are it. The British or Christians had a form of conversion. Hindus were becoming Christian through a process of conversion and baptism and so on. He said, why can't we do the thing in reverse? And so he came up with a ceremony, Shuddhikaran, to actually convert you back to Hinduism. And as a result, for those who are born non-Hindu but seek formally to become Hindus, and certainly there are, apart from David Frawley, many others. For example, there are foreigners who marry Indians and therefore feel a desire to adopt the faith of their spouses. In such cases, you can go to the Arya Samaj, go through the ceremony, there's certain tests to be followed, you practice, and then you get the certificate. That certificate is very useful, particularly in temples like Jagannath Puri or Padmanabha Swami Kshetram in Trivandrum, where there is a policy that non-Hindus will not be admitted. So I've actually met white people who were turned away until they then produced their Arya Samaj certificate and said, see, we're Hindu, and then they were allowed to come in. So in that sense, that's probably what he did. It's curious you ask, because I was supposed to be in a debate with him in Jaipur today, instead of which I decided to keep my word to Rahul and come here.
Sir, right
may
here,
may I please?
Okay, 1, 2, 3, and then we may be out of time. Right at the back. We'll move back from here. Sir?
Well, Tharoor Sahib.
Okay, sir, finish.
I read one of your books, Roy, The Love Story, and I loved it.
Thank you.
It has fair doses of karma also in it.
Yes, indeed.
And then
it is a love story.
Yes.
Part. It's also a hate story, unfortunately.
And then, in order to impress and maybe woo a woman I was fond of, I gave it to her. Of course, return requested. The result was, the book now adores her bookshelf. So, a compliment for you and a little heartbreak for me.
Oh dear. Thank you. Sir.
The microphone here in the second row, please.
And then the girl in the third row has other mics.
Just one. The last question, probably. Thomas More, Voltaire, and Dr. Radhakrishnan, and so many more celebrities said, we are deeply religious people who do not believe in God. What do you say about it?
Sir, that's partly the answer to Rahulji's question already, which is that you can be a religious person in the sense that you have a moral and ethical code. Not because you're afraid that God will punish you if you do something wrong, but because you believe it's the right way to be. Now, that's a very Hindu idea. The idea that you should live your dharma is about righteous conduct. It's about doing the right thing and doing the thing right while you're about it. And to my mind, it's a perfectly acceptable sentiment. By all means, be a religious person, don't believe in God, but consider you a good Hindu.
The lady standing up.
So,
Just one moment, sir. Yes, she has the mic, please. And the next.
Sir, I'm a great fan of yours and of course your vocab. Sir, can you please just describe today's gathering in one new word?
Today's gathering?
One new word.
Oh God, no, I don't make up new words like that, my dear. All I can say is it's been stimulating, it's been attentive, it's been large, and it's been very agreeable. None of which is a new word.
The gentleman here.
An era of darkness, followed by why I am a Hindu, and now the paradoxical Prime Minister. You're churning out one book per year. May I ask, how do you get all your facts and put them together? First question. Secondly, I think we are shortly, just before the 2019 elections, going to have the Ram Temple, contrived either legislatively or through the court. What do you think is likely to be the impact?
Good questions, both of them. On the first one, for the first time in my writing life, starting with Era of Darkness, I did start using researchers. I had never done that before because I knew from the days of my PhD that when you research for yourself, what you choose to read is itself something that helps define your conclusions. But in Era of Darkness, I already had my argument. I had already made that notorious speech at Oxford and so on. I knew what I wanted to say. It was, all I was looking for was substantiation. So I got a young man and said, you go and look up all the learned journal articles and books in the library on the Indian railways under the British and bring them to me. And then I will choose what facts and figures I derive from them and write. So when you say, how do you get the facts and how do you put them together? I can get facts, papers and so on through people who are willing to help me by going and finding the material. Then I tell them what I need to look for. They don't tell me. I say, this is what I want, and I will. And then how do you put them together? That's up to me. So I read them, I decide what strikes me as being of interest, what patterns emerge from what I have read, and so on. So what I'm saving myself is a time of actually going and digging up the material which somebody else does for me. And obviously it has to be somebody educated enough to understand that such and such an article is relevant and such an article is not. But otherwise it's very difficult for somebody with the kind of 16-hour days that Lok Sabha MPs have, with petitioners pouring at your door first thing in the morning and still are waiting on your doorstep when you come home last thing at night. It's impossible for me otherwise to do it. So I essentially end up getting someone to do that grunt work, and then the writing I do when I can. It can be at night, unfortunately very often, and it can be on planes sometimes, and it can be in whatever circumstances I can carve out for myself.
The second question I think it is a bit contentious, and I don't think it is.
It is contentious also because it's sub judice. That is, the Supreme Court has to make a determination on the appeal against the Allahabad High Court judgment of 2010. And therefore, none of us in politics has a right to, shall we say, take a view on a decision the court is still in the process of considering. Having said that, let me say that the fairest balance I can find to this is to say that, like most Hindus, it would be wonderful to have a Ram temple where Ram was born, but no good Hindu should have wanted to do it at the destruction of somebody else's place of worship. So
I don't want it. I'm a Hindu.
Well, I mean, I'm just saying that some formula that somehow expiates that wrong has to be part of a solution that creates a new right. Now, how the Supreme Court can do that, we have to leave it to the wisdom of the judges.
Thank you.
Well, one final question. Right at the back. Oh, it's wonderful to see so many young people engage in the conversation.
Good afternoon, sir. So, my question to you is, what are your views on the interpretation of religion in terms of terrorist organizations such as ISIS, Al-Shabaab, and their hatred towards the Western world and especially the United States of America?
Well, my old boss Kofi Annan at the UN once said, "There's nothing. It's never the faith. It's always the faithful." The problem is, there is no religion that actually departs from basic principles of good conduct and peace and so on and so forth. But in every religion, there's also elements that seem to imply a superiority over others. As I said, Hinduism being a rare exception. Hinduism is perhaps the only major religion that doesn't claim to be the only true religion. So there are faiths in which you can find elements that justify waging war and violence against others. Now, in those circumstances, all I can say is that if there are people who go out and do that, I think it's wrong to blame the religion for it. I think you should treat terrorism, violence, and war in the name of religion, bomb setting in the name of religion, as crimes, and treat the perpetrators as criminals. Their motive, to my mind, is secondary. Now, of course, I know that some will say that because their motive is explicitly religious, you can't separate it from the religion. But then, if, let's say, 1% of Muslims goes around setting off bombs, why is their religious motive more representative of Islam than 99% of Muslims who don't set off bombs? Now, how do you look at this and blame the religion or the faith? I think there are some amongst the faithful who have got the wrong end of the stick, and they should be dealt with firmly as criminals, because that's what they are.
We're approaching a number of elections, general elections. So could you give us an elevator pitch using as many Tharoorisms as you can as to why we should vote for you?
Well, if you live in Thiruvananthapuram, I can give you one set of reasons, but at the national level, why you should vote for my party is what I'd rather answer. I think, first of all, because the government that is now in office has served the nation so badly over 4.5 years that it doesn't deserve a second innings. We have seen self-inflicted disasters of demonetization. We've seen the botched rollout of GST. We've seen a government irresponsibly raising fuel taxes to an absurdly high level in order apparently to bail out banks and other institutions where certain influential individuals will get their debts forgiven. We've seen agriculture stagnating and farmer suicides going up. We've seen exports down, manufacturing growing at the lowest level since independence. You look around the country and there's not one good story to point to. And then on top of that, yes, it's a long elevator ride because we want to take it all the way to the top. On top of that, the government that said, or the Prime Minister who said, na khaunga, na khane dunga, was apparently only speaking about beef. Because certainly the Rafale scam, is a factor of something like 1,000 times larger than Bofors and has got 1,000 times less attention in the nation. And then you've got the horrendous ways in which the basic character and nature of our country is being changed. When human beings are being attacked, stripped, whipped, and even killed in the name of cow protection. When you're seeing a level of brazen intolerance. I mean, let's face it, of all the incidents related to cow protection in the history of independent India, 97% of them have happened in the last 4 years. That's an astonishing figure. And the fact is that, we just can't afford to treat this as business as usual. What worries me is that if you don't send this government packing, that you will actually end up with a different India from the one that we have cherished for 70 years. We had our flaws, but we built a country in which everybody could feel they had an equal stake, where no one really went around saying, I'm scared of saying this because I'll be dubbed anti-national, where no one went around saying, I'm not going to run a dairy farm anymore because if I transport my cows, I'll be murdered on the streets, where no one said that, 15-year-old boy returning home from buying clothes for Eid to show his mother was stabbed 35 times on a train and thrown off merely because he was Muslim. I mean, okay, we're reaching the top of the Empire State Building. And finally, I think we also have two contrasting styles of leadership to choose from. There's this guy who says, I'm the hero on the white stallion with upraised sword who's going to charge down, knows all the answers, will cut through the Gordian knots of all your questions. And there's another guy who comes on foot and says, look, I don't know all the answers. Maybe I don't even know all the questions, but you know what? I'll ask you what you want. And I'll come with a deep experience, bench strength of qualified, able people who've proven themselves over the years to work with you to find solutions to your problems. Isn't it time that we had responsible people in government again?
I'm going to put him in another short elevator ride. Why should we vote for you?
For me personally, well, because I've been a pretty good MP for Thiruvananthapuram. I mean, I've actually been able to deliver results, a lot more in the first term, but in the second term, We didn't have power either at the center or in the state, and still I was able to do a lot. I'm accessible to my constituents. I've dealt with dozens of problems every day of individuals who've had problems, particularly those who've had problems in foreign countries. I have been able to address some of the specific challenges of attracting investment, businesses and employment to my constituency. So I believe I have a strong case to the voters of Thiruvananthapuram, and I'm going to be making it.
Well, at the very least, you have our vote to become be reappointed along with Mani sitting on the front row as spokespersons for the Congress.
I don't think either of us is looking for that. We'll speak for ourselves, but we'll speak with conviction.
Thank you very much. This has been a wonderful audience and a wonderful speaker. Thank you.
And thank you, Rajiv.
हेलो कुछ डन चाहिए पीछे से चेयर लगानी जैसे लोग उठ रहे हैं लगा दो बंदे उठ गए लोग
Hello, can I have your attention?